Picture this. You're jolted awake by explosions, smoke fills your hallway, and strangers in tactical gear are screaming at you while your spouse is held at gunpoint. Later, you find out that none of this was actually even meant for you. Then the government claims that because of this incident, you can't even bring a lawsuit or challenge against them based on what happened, because their agents had discretion to plan the raid however they wanted and to also get this wrong. The Supreme Court, in response to this, struck that down with a 9-0 unanimous decision. And now the 11th Circuit has to reopen and reevaluate this case based on what the Supreme Court ruled. Let's talk about what is happening in this critical case. Before we jump in, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways is simply to subscribe. Click the notification bell and turn on all notifications because that helps ensure YouTube will send you these videos when I release them. As I mentioned, we're discussing a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court, which all gun owners and really all Americans should be aware of. This case is called Martin versus the United States, and it comes out of a suburban Atlanta area. Back in 2017, the FBI executed a pre-dawn raid against a family. But there's a huge problem that happened in this case. The FBI raided the wrong home, and the correct home they were supposed to raid was just 3 doors down the street. The family inside sued the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA, and the question became for the court, does the federal government get to walk away from liability, or can an ordinary citizen try to hold them accountable? On review, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous ruling in favor of the family and remanded the case back down to the 11th Circuit for a new decision in light of that ruling. And now, the 11th Circuit has set this challenge for new oral arguments early in just a couple months based on that new Supreme Court ruling. Here's what happened in this Martin case. An FBI agent was tasked with leading a pre-dawn raid against a home where they believed suspected gang members were hiding. The target address was a specific address, but instead of going there directly, the FBI agent in charge used his personal GPS. His GPS actually routed him to a completely different home 3 doors down, and that was the home owned by Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend at the time, and also their 7-year-old son. When the FBI agents arrived at that home without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades inside the home, pulled out the boyfriend and Katrina Martin, who were both hiding in a closet. I believe the boyfriend had a shotgun. They handcuffed them, held Katrina Martin at gunpoint. She was half-dressed at the time. They also pulled out the young child. After everyone was detained, the agents were searching the home, and one of the officers noticed that on a coffee table there was some mail with a different address on it. That's when they realized they'd made a huge mistake and had this "oh crap" moment. We raided the wrong home. The FBI agents then let them go and told them they would be back soon, that they would tell them what happened. So they left the home and went 3 doors down and raided the correct home. In response to this entire incident, the family sued the FBI. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is a law that allows ordinary people to sue the federal government for certain wrongful acts by federal employees when those employees are acting in the scope of their job. Normally, the government and individual agents are shielded, but the FTCA is one of those situations where the government has agreed to let citizens bring tort claims against the federal government and bring those in court. But the FTCA also comes with a long list of exceptions where you cannot bring lawsuits. One of those situations, and one of the issues in this case that was brought up, is called the discretionary function exception. In this case, the family tried to sue the FBI based on the agent's actions, but in response, the FBI claimed that the agent using his GPS and planning the raid was a discretionary function. Therefore, they fell under an exception in the FTCA, and the family could not bring this lawsuit. On review, a district court agreed with the FBI and dismissed this case, and then it was appealed up to the 11th Circuit. On review, the 11th Circuit once again ruled in favor of the FBI. The appeals court reasoned that the lead agent had discretion in how he prepared this pre-dawn raid. That discretion, they said, was enough to trigger the discretionary function exception, which meant the family's claims could not move forward. This case then, in response, went to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court granted review and ruled in this case. On review, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the family. The Supreme Court, in that unanimous opinion, which was authored by Justice Gorsuch, vacated the 11th Circuit's ruling and sent the case back down to them for re-review. So that is where this case currently is. It's in front of the 11th Circuit, set for oral arguments in light of what the Supreme Court just said in their new ruling. Now recently, the DOJ filed a new response in this case, and in it they argue that the court here, the 11th Circuit, should still rule in the same way, despite what the Supreme Court just said in their new ruling. They argue that is because the family's claims are still barred under other laws and still also barred under the FTCA. The government's central position is that the agent's mistaken entry into the wrong home resulted directly from discretionary decisions about how to conduct the pre-dawn raid and surveillance, how to approach the house in the dark, how to navigate without alerting suspects, how to identify the structure from external features, and how they plan this whole process. The FBI argues that no statute, regulation, constitutional rule, or any binding policy within the FBI actually dictates the specific steps that the agents had to take to evaluate the home and decide that this is the correct home. But now the Martins have filed their response to the FBI, and they're arguing that the 11th Circuit should reverse what they said before, based on what the Supreme Court just said in that ruling. In the brief, the Martins claim that the federal government cannot simply hide behind the discretionary function exception to escape liability for their botched raid of the home. They say that the Supreme Court already told the 11th Circuit to go back and take a hard first principles look at what discretionary function actually means. They argue that the history and precedent show it only protects actual policy decisions and implementation of regulatory programs, not basic operational screw-ups by a specific agent. They argue that executing a warrant at the correct address is a ministerial duty, not a policy choice. Federal agents have no discretion to just simply swap out the wrong home and do it however they want. Raiding the wrong home, traumatizing an innocent family, and ignoring the address on the warrant isn't a policy decision or policy-grounded conduct. It is unconstitutional, careless, and untethered from any legitimate federal policy. So they argue the discretionary function here should not apply. They argue in the brief that once this whole FTCA discretionary function shield is gone, this is really just a simple, straightforward case. The United States is liable if a private person in like circumstances would be liable in the state as well. So the plaintiffs argue that the 11th Circuit should follow the Supreme Court's direction, reject the government's overboard reading of the discretionary function exception, apply the ordinary private person standard, and essentially just simply send this case to trial. That's really what the family is ultimately asking for. They're just asking for a fair shot in review of this case by the trial court, because at this point, the trial court and the 11th Circuit have dismissed this case, saying that you can't even bring this lawsuit against the FBI. And that is happening despite what the Supreme Court just said. And once again, the FBI and the federal government are saying ignore what the Supreme Court said, rule the same way, don't let this lawsuit move forward. Like I mentioned, this case is heading for re-review in the 11th Circuit. In light of what the Supreme Court just said, the 11th Circuit has now set arguments to take place in this case during the week of March 23rd. Soon, the appeals court will have to re-evaluate this case based on what the Supreme Court just said in that 9-0 ruling. The Supreme Court's ruling in the Martin case narrows the government's ability to avoid lawsuits by claiming broad immunity. This case reinforces that the federal government and potentially the individual agents can be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or misuse their power. Think about the implications of this case. If the government's position had prevailed, it would mean that any time federal agents made a mistake during an operation, they could simply claim it was within their discretion and avoid all accountability. That would be a complete shield against lawsuits, even for the most egregious errors. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected that interpretation, They recognized that there has to be a limit on government immunity. Not every action federal agents take can be shielded by claiming discretion. This matters for gun owners particularly because we've seen numerous cases where federal agents have conducted raids, sometimes at the wrong addresses where firearms are present. The potential for tragedy is enormous. When agents burst into a home with flashbangs and tactical gear, homeowners who are lawfully armed might reasonably believe they're being attacked by criminals. The Martin family was fortunate that while the boyfriend had a shotgun, the situation didn't escalate to gunfire. But you can imagine how easily that could have happened. An armed homeowner, woken by explosions and seeing armed strangers in their home, might have defended themselves and been killed by federal agents who were at the wrong house. The fact that the government tried to claim total immunity for this kind of mistake is shocking. They argued that because the agent had discretion in planning the raid, the family had no recourse whatsoever for the trauma they experienced. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision sends a clear message. Discretion doesn't mean carte blanche to make terrible mistakes without consequences. Federal agents must be held to basic standards of competence, especially when conducting violent raids on American homes. This case is also important because it shows that sometimes the legal system does work. The District Court and the 11th Circuit initially sided with the government, dismissing the family's lawsuit entirely, but the family persevered, took it to the Supreme Court, and got a unanimous reversal. Now we wait to see what happens on remand. The 11th Circuit has oral arguments scheduled for the week of March 23rd. Will they follow the Supreme Court's clear direction and allow this case to proceed to trial, or will they find some other reason to dismiss it? The DOJ is clearly trying to preserve as much immunity as possible, arguing that even under the Supreme Court's ruling, the family's claims should still be dismissed. But the Martins have filed a strong response, arguing that the discretionary function exception simply doesn't apply to raiding the wrong house. As we get more information as it develops, I'll let you know. This is a case worth following because it impacts fundamental questions about government accountability and citizens' ability to seek redress when their rights are violated. If you like this video and want to support the channel, one of the best ways is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help fuel the algorithm and tell YouTube that you appreciate this type of content and it should share it to more people. Thanks for watching and stay informed about your rights.